All right, so I'm queuing up our keynote, who I'll introduce in just a moment, but I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment just to thank our wonderful colleagues across Candid, especially team members on the Network Days Planning Committee for the months of dedication in organizing this event for all of us. It certainly takes a village, so a hearty thank you to the photos and names of the people you see on these two slides, not just to the leads of the committee, but also to the contributors for creating the experiences that I hope you'll enjoy over the next few days. Now, to introduce our keynote, we're very, very honored today to have Eric Klinenberg here with us. You can actually access his full bio on the conference site. And so instead of reading it, I will highlight a couple of things about Eric. One is Eric is Helen Gold Shepard Professor of Social Science and Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He's the author of several books, including a most recent one called Palaces for the People: How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life. I think many of you might already be fans of and familiar with Eric. And for those of you that are newly being introduced to him, I'll let you know that we do have Eric's most recent book available for free through Candid's digital library on Overdrive. You'll see the link to the book pop up in the chat box now. The second quick fun fact about Eric that you won't find in his bio, he said he cried when the Cubs won the World Series, but here's the irony: he prefers New York pizza over Chicago pizza. I'll leave it at that. I'll hand it over to Eric. Eric, over to you.
Hey, thank you so much. I hope the technology is working. I hope you recognize in my love for the Chicago Cubs from my hometown city, Chicago, where I grew up, stands in deep tension with my commitment to New York City pizza after having spent the last 20 years of my life here. So it's a time for multiple allegiances and figuring out how to get through this strange time. Now, this is, speaking of strange times, I'm now staring at a screen that's got a lot of white text boxes with letters of people I'm just getting to know, and I can see myself and I can't see anything else. And I know that there's, a lot of people out there. And one of the really difficult things one of the many difficult things about this moment where we're separated from each other is that when you're giving talks, you just don't get the same kind of feedback that you ordinarily get face to face. And so while I'm here, if there's anything that you're confused about, if there's something that's not coming through well, if you see me falling off the deep end, or if you just want to engage, feel free to use the chat button to raise a hand, maybe to express yourself more than anything else. I just want to have some connection to you so that I know that we're all together. And that's really the thing I want to talk about today, is the nature of connection over this past period of our lives and also moving forward. And this is a topic that I've worked on for 20 some years now, the nature of our interactions, the quality of our human connections, the mood in our social world, and how it all comes together to build this kind of magical thing that I know a lot of us seek out much of the time, that we call community, and what happens when it goes wrong. Unfortunately, much of the conversation recently is about how it has gone wrong and what we can do to fix it. And, on the one hand, the tough news is there's a lot to fix. On the other hand, it feels to me, and I don't know if you share this view, but it feels to me like we're starting to enter into a new moment. I think more and more of us are thinking about how to rebuild, about how we come back in different shape, so that when we return to whatever world we have, we're not just accepting the status quo from before. We're not accepting the diminished world that we live in now. We're actually doing something that's uplifting, that has potential. And what I want to talk to you today is my sense of how we start to do that. And the way I want to begin is I want to kind of take you back to March of 2020, that pretty dark time when the pandemic was really just kind of kicking in here in the United States, and we were getting a sense of how much we need to change. And I remember being at home and hearing a report about the World Health Organization recommending that the way that we get through this kind of infectious disease, the way that we survive is by becoming socially distant. I don't know if you remember that moment. We were advised like social distancing is the key strategy when we're dealing with an infectious disease that we don't understand very well. We didn't really know much about masks. We didn't have any medication. We're told the way to get through this is to be socially distant. And I have to say that I understood what that message was about. I understood that concept. It was a new concept for a lot of us, socially distant. I knew what they were trying to get across. They wanted us to protect each other. But it felt to me like that idea of social distancing had it exactly wrong. It was exactly the opposite of what we needed. Because for me, at least, when I hear the concept of social distance, it tells me, the way that we need to survive this thing is by getting inside of our home and closing the door and cutting off our ties to all the people around us, make sure that we're okay, make sure that our families are okay, and kind of to hell with everybody else, protect ourselves. That seemed exactly the opposite of what we needed to do, because from the beginning of the pandemic, it was clear to me, at least, that this was an event about our linked fate. A pandemic with an infectious disease is a reminder that the condition of your neighbor inevitably affects you, that how you invest in each other as a society affects you, right? If you live in a society, for instance, where you don't have kind of basic labor protection, and people who work in, say, the fast food industry feel that if they don't show up to work, even if they're sick, they're going to wind up losing their job or losing money. People who are sick will go to work, right? And we know, by the way, that in the United States, our labor protections historically have been pretty weak on this. And so a lot of sick people, more than in other societies, wind up going to work anyway because they're afraid of the repercussions of not showing up. And we also know, by the way, that if you live in a society where you invest in education, you really invest a lot in high quality education for everyone, then when there's a new coronavirus that arrives and it's potentially lethal, then citizens can tell the difference between that new coronavirus and the ordinary flu. But if you live in a society that doesn't educate people very well, that doesn't invest in that, it's much more difficult to do that. We become much more prone to accept misinformation and conspiracy theories and to do what we were going to do anyway. And of course, in a lot of parts of the United States, we fail to invest much in public education. And so for me, it seemed the thing about this pandemic experience is what it really has required to survive, to get through, is social solidarity. Right? We need to actually be aware of how we affect each other, how we engage with each other, what being conscientious of the people around us means. And yes, when there's an infectious disease, we need to do something different. But what I think we need to do different was physical distancing. The message from the World Health Organization from the beginning should have been physical distance, social solidarity, right? Physical distance. It's being physically close to me that determines whether, if I sneeze or sing or cough, you wind up getting sick. But it has nothing to do with social distance, right? It's physical distance. And now I think we might be turning a corner. And I've been wrong on this before, and we keep on thinking we've turned the corner and we just hit yet another block. But in the last few weeks, I've started to get invited to do events in person, not just on the screen. We're teaching classes in person throughout the country right now. The Delta surge seems to be receding. Maybe we're going to get to this point where even the physical distancing is less important than it needs to be. But how do we go about, getting over the social distancing idea, and why should we be so concerned about that distance? That's actually my entry into this whole area of research and writing and speaking. Years ago, the first big project I did as a sociologist was a study of a heat wave that hit my home city, Chicago, in the 1990s. And it was a devastating heat wave. It killed more than 700 people in just a couple of days. And I know it's funny to think of that as devastating, because we basically lived through a year and a half where we have multiple heat waves every day. And I fear a little bit that we've come to kind of normalize that experience. But it's worth paying attention to the fact that 700 plus deaths in excess of the norm is a big deal, and we should learn from it. And I was just starting to work as a sociologist when I learned about this event. And I was in California. I went back to my hometown and started to do interviews and research and try to figure out what had happened in Chicago. And what I learned about the deaths that week is that it wasn't just that a lot of people died of heat. It was that hundreds of people died alone. They were discovered in their homes days, long after they died in many cases. And it suggested these deaths a kind of social breakdown that was worrisome. And my whole career as a social scientist took off when I decided to draw a map of who died and where in the city of Chicago during this crisis. And when I drew the map the first time, what I noticed was the obvious. I noticed what you would predict, which is that when there's a big disaster that hits a city, it's the poor neighborhoods, it's the segregated neighborhoods, it's the neighborhoods that don't have a lot of political power, that aren't served very well in ordinary times or in crises. Those are the places that had the highest deaths. And that was politically significant to note, but as a scientist, it was not especially surprising, right? You don't win a Nobel Prize for discovering something that you would expect to happen. So that wasn't super interesting. But what became interesting is that I drilled down a little bit and I started to look at the neighborhoods in Chicago that had the lowest death rates during this heat wave, the places that, to use today's language, were the most resilient, that fared really well. And sure enough, there are a lot of, more affluent neighborhoods there. But also what really stood out is that there were a set of neighborhoods in Chicago that looked like they belonged to the places that had the worst outcomes, the highest deaths. They were very poor. They were segregated and almost entirely African-American, which was a big risk factor in the heat wave. They had a lot of older people, every reason to believe that they would fare badly. In fact, many of them were just across the street from neighborhoods that had been death spots during this disaster. But for some reason that I needed to understand, these places did terrifically well. In fact, many of them did better than the most affluent neighborhoods in Chicago. So I went into the neighborhoods and started walking around and talking to people and getting a sense of how daily life worked. And the conclusion I came away with after a lot of work, and this was really what launched my career as a social scientist, is that the difference between the places that were demographically, basically the same, but that had really different outcomes, obviously wasn't race, it wasn't poverty, it wasn't the age structure of the neighborhoods. The difference is that neighborhoods that fared well, that were resilient, had this kind of booming social infrastructure. That's the concept I came up with. They had a social infrastructure of sidewalks and small businesses like coffee shops and diners. They had churches, they had community organizations, they had public institutions, a kind of an infrastructure that supported social life. And what it means is if you live in a neighborhood like that, even if it's poor, that social infrastructure draws you out of your home and helps you generate these kinds of casual interactions that build into, social ties and then friendships and then aggregating up over time something more like community. I saw that consistently in places that fared well, regardless of their poverty level in Chicago. But then if you looked at the neighborhoods that had high deaths during this disaster, their social infrastructure was bombed out. They were depleted. They had lost population. The commercial life was gone. There weren't really places where people kind of sat around casually and just hung out on slow days. And what that meant is if you live in a neighborhood like that and it's very hot out and you don't go outside to socialize, people don't notice because they're not observing things on a daily basis. They're not interacting with you on a daily basis. They don't know that you're potentially at risk, even if they live right by you. Right. So social infrastructure, when it's rich and robust, works well. It brings us out. It supports interaction. It helps us understand our neighbors and who they are and what they need and when they're potentially in trouble. And social infrastructure, when it's emaciated, does the very opposite. It leads us to hunker down. And that turned out to be important in the heat wave. But what was in some ways even more significant is I noticed that the neighborhoods that had rich social infrastructure, again, even when poor and segregated and vulnerable in so many ways, wound up having life expectancy that was many years longer than the life expectancy in the neighborhoods across the street that didn't have them. And so in this last book that Zohra just talked about, called Palaces for the People, I really tried to build out this idea and elaborate on it and figure out what it means and track it across different contexts. I came to develop the concept of social infrastructure so that when I refer to it, what I mean is the physical places that shape our interactions. Again, when I say social infrastructure, it's not like a metaphor. I've come to believe that social infrastructure is just as real as the infrastructure for power, for water, for transit, for communications. It's a real, tangible, physical thing. And when we invest in it, when we build it well, when we maintain it, when we program it, we get all kinds of returns to our social life. Life of our organizations, the life of our neighborhoods, the life of our cities, towns, suburbs. When we don't invest in it, when we let it fall apart, if we don't program it, if we don't maintain it, it becomes all the more difficult for us to engage with each other, right? To build the thing that comes after social infrastructure, which is social capital, those relationships there. It's much more difficult to do that. And if the concept still seems a little bit vague to you, let me give you another kind of easy example of what I mean by social infrastructure. Think of a playground as a kind of social infrastructure. Okay, think of a playground. It's not a natural thing, by the way. There's no moment in the Bible where, on the fourth day, God creates the playground. You don't find that line there. We didn't kind of inherit it as creatures in the earth. The playground is a design. It's a concept. It's something we decided to invest in and build. And when I grew up in Chicago, again, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And, Chicago in the decades before that had put a lot of money into neighborhoods. They had built up parks, they had built public housing, they had built libraries and playgrounds, things like that. But by the time that I was born, the city was in a fiscal crisis, and it was worried that it didn't have enough money to keep those things up. And so the playground that was by the house that I lived in was really in bad shape. The equipment was old and damaged. There was often, broken glass on the surface where we were playing. I know a lot of times my parents didn't want me to be there because the playground seemed like the kind of place that I should avoid. And I contrast that with what I've seen in a number of cities and communities since then, which is a kind of reinvestment in playgrounds. And, I live in New York City right now and had the benefit of raising kids. My kids are still young, and I've raised them in an environment where there are a lot of playgrounds that are a lot nicer. And I started to think the other day, how many relationships exist in New York City, this decade, because we built a playground and decided to design it well and to maintain it, and put terrific equipment in there. Like if we go across the city of New York, how many relationships are there because two parents or grandparents or nannies or caretakers, two grown-ups who take their kids to the same swing set every afternoon, after a few visits when they saw each other, decided to put their phones down and actually have a conversation. And the conversation turned into something like like a play date or a meal together after we left the playground. And then, the friends met other friends, something built up. I just ask yourself, as I sometimes do, how many relationships exist in your city because of the playgrounds that are there? And think about what would happen to all the people with children, who are looking for those kinds of connections if we hadn't come up with the idea of the playground, or if we just let the playgrounds go to waste, as we did in Chicago when I was a kid. That's what I mean by social infrastructure, right? That's what I mean by it. And it's interesting because I left Chicago. I wrote this dissertation about the heat wave. I became a professor at Northwestern, and a few years after, I moved to New York City and began my love affair with New York City pizza. When I got here, I got really interested in the social infrastructure of New York. It works a little differently than Chicago. And I've been interested for a long time. I was interested in the heat and interested in kind of the issue of climate and community and connection. And some of you probably remember Hurricane Sandy when it came through New York in 2012. And right after it happened, I started doing a lot of writing about how social infrastructure mattered in that disaster. And one day, kind of, I got, to my great surprise, I got this message out of the blue from the Obama administration. I don't know if anybody here remembers Barack Obama. He was the president. I can't remember the guy who was president before, more recently, but there's a guy named Barack Obama who was president, and they reached out and they said, look, we're interested in thinking about recovery and rebuilding after Sandy in a creative way. Typically FEMA comes in and they just give communities money to build back what they had before. They're thinking like, what would happen if we tried to do something different and kind of more exciting? And they said, we've been reading your work on social infrastructure, and we're starting this design competition called Rebuild by Design. We're trying to get the world's leading architects and landscape architects and engineers and city planners to pitch ideas for what kind of infrastructure would help us build community better and build systems better for 21st century threats. And they asked me if I'd be the research director for that project. And of course I said yes. And it was a very high pressure, high stakes competition. There were about 148 teams from around the world that competed, and on the line was potentially about $2 billion of federal money and state money to do these ambitious projects. And so a lot of pressure on the teams, and we got down to the final 10, and my job was about kind of showing these teams around the region that was affected by Sandy. So, New York and Connecticut and New Jersey principally, but all parts of them, and showing them the different needs and vulnerabilities and possibilities in these places. And there was this one team that I remember feeling really stressed about what to do. It was high stakes, and the eyes of the world were watching them. And they had done amazing work before this competition in the Gulf Coast after Katrina, helping to communities rebuild. And they were struggling to come up with an idea for what they wanted to do. And they came to me one day and they said, Eric, we've been listening to you talk about social infrastructure. We get why it matters. We get that, like, when things break down, it's people's connections to each other that make the difference between life and death. And we want to try to build systems that promote that kind of connection. And we've come up with this idea that we want to pitch to you called the Resilience Center. We want to build a resilience center. And I said, that sounds really interesting. Like, can you tell me about it? And they said, well, yes, imagine that you have a building that, we build a prototype in one neighborhood for the kind of building that we could, build at scale throughout the country, in every neighborhood and in every city. This resilience center, they said, it'd be like a public building, and it would be open 6 or 7 days a week. It would be staffed by these resilience professionals whose job would be to be kind of like aggressively welcoming. They'd make sure that people in the community knew that they were wanted there. They said the Resilience Center itself would have lots of different rooms to support different activities for different people at different stages of their lives. They said, we want to be really expansive, but we know based on how neighborhoods work, that the people who are going to use this Resilience Center the most are very old people and very young people, because they're the people who are like most rooted in place. They're the most attached to the neighborhood. And they said, we'd like to, for the younger people, we'd have like story time and reading rooms and play spaces, and we'd have comfortable furniture for the grownups because the little kids aren't going to come here by themselves. We'd have like chairs and couches, and maybe we'd have Wi-Fi access and maybe machines and tablets. And for the older people, we'd have big tables, and they could have current events classes and film nights and activities like that. And they were really excited about the idea, and they said, what do you think? And I listened to them and heard them out, and I said, well, it sounds really exciting to me. And I've been a professor for a long time, so I know that the first thing I'm always supposed to say when someone pitches an idea to me is like, oh wow, that's great work, really interesting, which I did. And then I paused for a second, and I felt compelled to say, by the way, have you ever heard of the library? Because it seemed to me that in a way, in their pitch to build this new thing called the Resilience Center, they had overlooked the fact that we already have this institution that does very similar kinds of things in just about every neighborhood and every suburb, every town, every community across the country. And at first, I was a little bit frustrated about this omission by them. Like, why is it that we always feel like we need to invent some new thing? But then I realized that actually they were saying something important, and the fact that they came up with this pitch represented something. And that is that it seems to me like so often as we hit moments like the one we're in now, when we have a chance to rebuild, we want to do something different, we reach for, technology and a new design and, a brand new concept, and fail to recognize some of the achievements that we've made in the past that are pretty remarkable. We have a tendency, I think, to overlook and forget about some of the incredible things that we have already created, but, failed to maintain and reinvest in, so that we get less out of them. And really, the library is one of the best examples of that I can think of. It really is an extraordinary thing, that we have this, and it's the kind of thing I think about as we move forward. What is a library? What does it represent? What kind of model is it for the world that we build moving forward? I'm not just speaking to you about the library per se as a specific place. It's the idea of the library and the fact that we came up with it that's so amazing to me. I don't know if you're library users, if you've been to your public library recently, but I mean, one thought experiment I like to do, which I ask you to take with me as we start to wrap up my kind of more formal lecture and move into the conversation, is, imagine a world in which the library did not exist. Imagine that there was no such thing as a library. And I pitched it to you today. My talk for Candid was about, what a library represents and what it's like and how it works. And we all got excited about it. And at the end of the conversation, we decided, we're going to go together to the White House, and we're going to pitch to, pretty liberal president right now, this idea. We'd say, President Biden, those of us at the Candid meeting today came up with this big idea. We're calling it the library. And here's the concept. We would like you to support building a giant building, like a big central library in every major American city. Like in some places, it's going to be the grand building on Fifth Avenue, and it'll have, enormous granite lions at the entryway. In Los Angeles, let's make it a tower right downtown. In Chicago, we'll have it be this postmodern building in the middle of the loop. There'll be grand central libraries in every American city. And then we'll have branch libraries, branch buildings in every single neighborhood of every city. And we'll also put a specialized library in every suburb and town. So everyone has access to a library. Most people could walk to them. And then we said, in these libraries, what we'd like you to do is fill them up with books and videos and periodicals, computers, tablets, comfortable furniture. It's really important for us that everyone who's here has access to our shared cultural heritage. And we're going to put that shared cultural heritage into the library, with specialization, so that people who have all kinds of niche interests can find themselves there too. And we're going to staff these libraries with these public employees we call librarians, who will be decently paid and respected. And their job is, fundamentally to ask people when they walk into the library building, how can I help you? That's their main job, is to ask, how can I help you? And then we should be clear that these libraries are going to be open 6 or 7 days a week, all day. They're going to be open to everyone, regardless of your race, your ethnicity, your social class, whether you have a home or don't have a home, whether you speak English, even whether you're a citizen. People who aren't citizens are welcome to come and use it as well. Mr. President, one more thing. Everything that we have in the library is going to be available for people to take out and bring home for free. And we're just going to use an honor system to make sure that they bring it back. Okay, that's imagine that we make that pitch to President Biden today. Now, I don't know how you feel. I can't see any of you. I'm literally just talking into a screen full of black boxes that have some white letters. And then I know that there's some number of people who are participants. So you could be laughing hysterically. You could be sleeping. You could be doing email as I say all this. I have no idea how you're responding to it. But, my view is that this proposal that I've just put out there would come across to President Biden during this moment of kind of high potential, when there's $3.5 trillion on the table for potentially building new infrastructure. If we pitched that idea to President Biden, we would be laughed out of Washington, D.C., because in the abstract, that idea is about as radical as you could possibly imagine an idea being, right? That we would build all of these places, right? That we would give things to people to use without asking them to pay anything, that everyone could have access regardless of their class or citizenship status, like that we would have public employees programming these places. I mean, there are very few ideas that could be more radical than that right now. And yet, the amazing and shocking thing, which I want us to think about, is that's not a fantasy. We actually already have that stuff. Like all that, we did it. We actually built out those libraries. We filled them up with amazing cultural stuff. We keep them open. We staff them. They need to be updated. They have all kinds of problems. They're not doing nearly the amount of things that they could be doing. People are not as aware about all the things that they offer as they could be. But once upon a time, we came up with that idea and we built it. And I guess the thing that I have been asking myself that I want to share with you, because I think it matters for our conversation about community and connection and how we build back from here, is what was it about us at the period when we started to build out those libraries, the period when we built out the playgrounds, the period when we built out the parks? Like what was it about who we were and what we valued that said that that was okay, that said that that was the right thing to do, that that was the right way to invest in each other? And then I guess we should also be asking ourselves, why is it that those ideas seem so far-fetched to so many people today? And what are we doing with this kind of legacy that we've inherited, all of the physical places that are part of the world we live in now, but that are kind of barely hanging on in so many cities, in so many suburbs, in so many communities, places that haven't gotten the love that they deserve. Why are we searching to have meaningful community interaction on places like Facebook, which is promising to deliver that to us, and not recognizing all the things that we could get out of our parks and libraries and playgrounds and other shared social infrastructure if we faced up to what they could potentially do, what they have done before, and how we could remake them today? I think these questions are really urgent. In fact, I can't think of many things that are more urgent, because it's not just COVID that we have to come back from now, right? It's a moment where distrust is rising and spiraling out of control. Where we see people who are different from us as if they are enemy combatants, who would like to see us gone. Distrust is high, division is high. It's not just that we are socially distant in the pandemic, it's that we've developed social distance as a survival strategy for dealing with difference in too many places. And we know that it doesn't work. You can't survive COVID by just locking your door and staying indoors. It doesn't work. And you surely can't survive climate change. You surely can't deal with the problems of racial injustice and racial division that have long marked this country and so many others. You surely can't redress the problems of inequality that we find in our cities and communities and organizations, right? Doing that demands that we break down the barriers that create social distance, find new ways to achieve that thing I called for, when I started talking 30 minutes ago, which is solidarity, right? Finding that connection to each other. And it's my argument today that we do that not just by making a cultural and ideological commitment to it. We can't just say that we value community. We can't just say that we value justice with words and hope that everyone else agrees. That's not the way to do it. It doesn't work. It's too soft. It's too weak. We have to make investments, and we have to build things, and we have to build common places and shared spaces, gathering places where we have some capacity to work with each other, hopefully doing things that we value, things that we recognize need to get done. And it's in the process of those shared activities. It's in the process of taking on challenges together that I think we have some chance to build back a world, a society, a city, an organization that we value and want to stick with, and that's worth dedicating everything we've got to moving forward. I don't think we solve the problem of division and distrust on Facebook or Twitter. I don't think we solve it by building a wall. I think we solve it by building something that looks like a library. It doesn't have to be a library, but something that carries that spirit with it. And that's what I wanted to share with you in my remarks today. So thank you very much.
Eric, thank you so much. You're right in the beginning when you said virtual connections like this are a little hard, especially when you're serving in a keynote function and unable to see your audience. But I have been monitoring some of the chats that are coming in. Earlier, you also said since you can't see the audience, you don't know if they're laughing hysterically, sleeping, or drinking coffee. It might be a combination of all of those, but we do have a pretty active audience. And I have a couple of questions for you, and I'll invite our audience again to use the chat feature on our conference site to post any questions they have directly for Eric. But I want to highlight a couple of comments that we received from folks in the audience. Again, keeping in mind that this is a lot of the members of our audience today are representing libraries, large and small, throughout different pockets of the United States. And so this topic definitely does, I think, resonate with a lot of folks. One of our partners in St. Louis said they enjoyed hearing you speak in their city a couple of years ago, and they often reference your book and the Carnegie Palaces for the People reference. When folks visit and admire their library, they say to them, "This is your palace, folks. Make yourselves at home." I thought that was pretty beautiful.
That's very nice. I remember St. Louis was one of the last places I went before the world shut down, and it was a remarkable trip. I got to speak at the main St. Louis library, which is an extraordinary place, and also visit this small library in Ferguson, which proved to be such an important place for that community as it was dealing with police violence and the question of what kind of community they want to rebuild in the context of racial conflict. So thank you for saying that.
Another one of our partners mentioned the following. I lived on military installations for decades. They have really strong social infrastructure. My kids were so lucky to have grown up on them. I'll add a little bit to that to say I have family that live in Florida, and one set of my family members live in a neighborhood with a lot of retired military families that also reside in that neighborhood, and I can also attest to the fact that in terms of social infrastructure and being close knit, that community also I think is a strong representation of connectivity. And one more comment before we get into questions is one of our partners mentioned, I also connected the local schools with the library and made a special connection with the English language learners to introduce them to what a library had to offer. It was a packed house.
It's amazing the number of things that libraries do that I think people don't always appreciate. And, the library people on this, in this conference will remember that a few years ago, there was this economist who wrote an article for Forbes magazine. And he wrote that, libraries once served the public good, but he hasn't seen any really good cost benefit analysis showing the value proposition of the modern library. So he argued that until you can really prove that libraries benefit the public, we should knock them all down and replace them with Amazon stores. And it was a really bold argument. And it was this amazing moment. I got really upset when I saw it. But what happened is that the librarians of the world united, and they got onto Twitter, and they started to kind of testify about all the things that happen in libraries, all the things that people do, and the services they provide, including teaching English as a second language. Libraries do more ESL instruction than any other institution in the United States. And, helping people who are incarcerated, get reintegrated into society, all kinds of assistance with job search. They do a lot of citizenship training, for people who are here and on the path towards legal citizenship. They do all these programs to provide companionship for older Americans. In the book, I write about this Library Lanes virtual bowling league in Brooklyn, where older patrons of libraries put on bowling jerseys and compete with each other, via Xbox in the community centers. And of course, all the things they do for literacy, for teenagers. For providing internet connection. I mean, the list of things that libraries do, is truly remarkable. And so many librarians posted these kinds of stories that within 24 hours, Forbes wound up taking that article down off the internet. They literally got rid of it because it was so embarrassingly bad. But during this past year of the pandemic, as we shut down, and I saw libraries, expand their digital offerings and amplify their Wi-Fi signals so that people could, go out to be in the vicinity of libraries and get Wi-Fi if they didn't have it at home, because we don't have universal access. As libraries did things like yoga classes virtually and reading classes for kids virtually and exercise, current events, all that stuff. I started thinking, like, what would the world have looked like during the pandemic if we had knocked them all down and replaced them with Amazon stores? I mean, my impression is that Jeff Bezos has done fine for himself, even without having all the library space for himself. Amazon certainly had quite a year in 2020. But what kind of year would we have had if we didn't have access to a resource like the library? And I think it's really important for us to be asking ourselves those kinds of questions, because as we rebuild, fundamental issues about who we are at stake. And I don't think we have answers yet to what's going to happen.
I'm glad you addressed that, because one of my questions would have been, how have you seen social infrastructure organizations evolve? And I think you've answered that to a good degree. A follow-up is there a perception of value of social infrastructure? Is it traceable in any generational or cultural way? For example, are younger people more or less inclined to understand the value of places like libraries and parks and so on?
Well, I think we're learning about that, and I think we'll be voting, voting in some ways with our feet by where we go, and maybe also making some big decisions. Like, when I pay attention to this debate about infrastructure and policy right now, and I watch the White House and the Senate and the House, battle over what we're going to fund, I'm struck by how much reference we make to this idea of social infrastructure, which really wasn't on the table a few years ago. And, there's clearly a number of people who are saying, when I use the concept infrastructure, all I mean are bridges and tunnels and airports. That's what we need to do. But I think there is also a view that infrastructure needs to be defined more expansively and capaciously. And, clearly the generation that came through the New Deal recognized that, and they built up this country to what it is today, building all kinds of, resources and places that we continue to visit and to benefit from. But I do think that there was there's been a sustained period of time in the US where the notion was, let's rely on the market and not the government. If there's something that's valuable, the marketplace will produce it and people will pay for it. And let's not rely on government to take care of those things. And, clearly that model has worked very well for some people in this country. But I think one of the things that we're hearing is that a lot of people feel like it has not worked out very well. They don't really feel like they're getting what they want for their lives, what they need to get by from a world that's organized solely around the market like that. And so it seems to me like there are a lot of people in this country who would really like to see a commitment to social infrastructure. I was surprised to learn, as I did when I was working on Palaces for the People, that the demographic group that's most likely to use libraries these days are younger Americans under the age of 25. They're the heaviest users of the library. And, you would think it's kind of like this old institution, and it would be, dominated by older patrons, but the very reverse is true. Younger people go to them because they get something in return.
So you touched on investment. Would love to get your thoughts on what are the best ways to advocate or make the case for more investment in social infrastructure, or maybe what a reinvestment looks like in the state of the world today. Knowing that COVID is not going to last forever, physical distancing hopefully will not last forever either, but what does reinvestment look like?
Well, first of all, we're seeing it in a lot of communities, here in the U.S. and in other societies too. That there are a number of places that are actually rebuilding their libraries so that they can, rise up to 21st century challenges. I talked about being in this older library in St. Louis, which is kind of one of the old classic libraries, as 19th century palace, and it's a glorious, amazing space. But just before the pandemic, I was in Austin, Texas, which built a library in the last couple of years. And it's like a library built as a community center. It's got everything from like a high-end party space that you can rent out on the top floor, and a nice coffee shop and restaurant on the ground floor, to like a maker space and play areas and all kinds of digital technologies that people can learn to use there. Beautiful reading rooms, collaborative workspaces. I've been to libraries in Calgary, in Helsinki, Finland, and some places where the society has basically said, we are going to create the 21st century library as a model that people can use when they think about what they want their city to be like. Like, this is going to be one of these things that expresses who we are. It's going to stand as not just a resource, but also as a symbol for the kind of society we want to be. And so I think that we're in one of those moments right now where we have to make a decision about what we value, and what we want to build. What we build out of this period that we're in right now is going to say a lot about who we are. And I think we're in the middle of this historic fight. And the infrastructure is not a very sexy word. It's like kind of technical and wonky. It's hard to get really worked up about infrastructure. But if you're not engaged in this debate right now, that's literally happening in real time, you're probably missing out on a contest that is going to determine a great deal of our collective future. And so you can engage at the local level, like, what are the plans for building out parks near you? What are the plans for building, playgrounds, libraries, schools? Who's making those decisions, and how are they being made in the context of other kinds of choices? Like, I would really encourage everyone to get involved in that conversation, because it's our collective future that's on the line.
Thank you, Eric. I probably have two final questions for you. The last one will be, what's next for you? But before we get to that, one of our audience members is asking, how did something that was once so common become so rare? I grew up in one of those tight-knit African-American communities in Chicago that you referred to. Any theories about how we lost that social connection? Is it just the internet?
I don't think it's just the internet. I actually, I think if you go to neighborhoods throughout the country, including, Black neighborhoods in Chicago and New York, and white neighborhoods in Chicago and New York and many other cities, you see a mix there. The places that really got hit hard, they lost the jobs. That was a big story in Chicago. My family was on the south side of Chicago for a long time, and there were all these big factories there that employed people in my family for generations, and they closed up shop, and the factories moved to other countries, first to other regions of this country and then to other countries. And when the factories left, so did the unions, so did the pubs, so did the athletic leagues. Eventually, the neighborhoods got depleted, and like the one neighborhood my family lived for a while, was called North Lawndale. It lost 50% of its population from its peak to today, maybe even a little bit more than that. And that's true of a lot of different neighborhoods on the south side and west side of Chicago. And it just, when you have physical depletion, you lose your social infrastructure, and it's harder to have those kinds of connections. Whereas, neighborhoods, and there are a lot, like in my book, I write about some neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago that did not lose their population, that did not lose jobs at the same rate. And some of them are, still very segregated and still have other issues, but they've managed to maintain a level of social connection that I think helps people out. And so the thesis in my work has been that there is a physical foundation for a lot of our social connections, and that we need to pay attention to how our physical environment shapes us. The internet is obviously everywhere now, and has profoundly affected the way that we connect with each other. And I don't believe that, Facebook is a net positive for our connections, and certainly not for the quality of our democratic life. I think it's really dividing us. Maybe some of you enjoyed this 5-hour holiday we got from Facebook and Instagram yesterday, and realized, there are things that we could be doing offline that would be really good for us. And so, I think we get that stuff back by, building up physical places, not building up online. And that could go to your last question too. But what I'm working on right now is I'm writing a book that's actually about the year 2020 and about the pandemic, and about what we went through and where we go next. And I'm thinking a lot about this question. How do we rebuild? Because it seems to me like we're in this unique historical moment. Everything is up for grabs. You could tell me in 10 years from now, we will have shredded our democracy. We will be a more authoritarian society. We will be, atomized and distrustful and individuated and lonely. And I could totally see that story. That I could see the path to that. But I also think we have a maybe more plausible path towards doing the very opposite, which is, really building something that's exciting and innovative and different, investing in each other, building better places, using the library as our model once again. But, to do that, we really need to make sure that we're recognizing the good things that we have, that we appreciate, what we've built and what we've built well, and how to build things better. And that we rebuild some sense of kind of collective spirit, collective sensibility, some idea about, linked fate, to go back to the COVID, concept. I mean, maybe this whole experience has been maybe it's our last big chance to recognize what we need to do in order to get better. I still think we have time, but it's going to require an enormous amount of work and commitment from a lot of us.
Absolutely agreed, Eric. Thank you so much. This has been really inspiring. And although it was unplanned, I think my and Julieta's commentary at the beginning about being a community is what you have also further reinforced through your work. We really appreciate you. Thanks for the inspiration. I'll share a final quote from one of our audience members, and then we will bid you farewell. They said, after reading Palaces, I have a fully different thinking about my neighborhood and community and our ability to be resilient. So that's a good nugget for you, and a reinforcement of our thanks and our audience for being with us today, Eric. Thank you all so much. For our audience members, you have a 5-minute break, and at 1:10, our next session will begin. Thank you, Eric. Much appreciated.
Thanks. Hope to see you all in person sometime. Bye-bye.
Hope so. Bye-bye.